But today, the Philippines has leapfrogged, and we're catching up so fast to the rest of the world. And all of that leads to some great, great opportunities for founders to find great businesses that are really just capitalizing on the digitalization of this country. I think that you're actually seeing a lot of people coming back to the Philippines, a lot. And it's becoming a very interesting place to actually, work and start a business. But we are definitely at the precipice of some amazing digital transformation in this country.
Hi everyone, today's guest is Franco Varona, the managing partner at Foxmont Capital Partners, an independent, Philippine-focused venture capital fund. Now, the Philippines is not normally a country that founders or investors would normally look at, but with an increasingly educated and tech-savvy young population of over 100 million, Franco believes we cannot ignore this part of the world any longer. In this episode, we explore why Franco returned to the Philippines and why other overseas-born Filipinos should too, his journey from his time as a founding member of Grab Philippines to when he established the first independent VC firm in the country, and the massive opportunities in the Philippines for entrepreneurs and investors. You're listening to the Borderless Podcast, a podcast that focuses on people that have taken a different path in life. I explore international perspectives, personal development, and entrepreneurship with a focus on Asia and Asians between cultures. Franco is a great storyteller, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Let's get straight into it. Hi Franco, thanks for joining me today. Really appreciate you, taking some time off, and, even saying hi to me. So really appreciate it. Maybe as a starting point, just to give an audience a bit of an introduction, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sean, thanks for having me, and thanks for inviting me to your podcast. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to your audience as well. Just to give you a brief background of myself, my name is Franco Varona. I am the managing partner of an early stage independent venture capital firm in the Philippines called Foxmont Capital Partners. I make a big point about saying early stage and independent because, well, we'll go into this later on, but the Philippines actually has a lot of other venture capital firms, but all of those are connected to corporates, corporate venture capital firms. So we are the only independent one operating in the country so far. And I've been doing this for 3 years now. So Foxmont itself was incorporated in 2018.
Yeah, so it's quite a young company or young VC firm, putting it that way. But before we get into how you got into VC and whatnot, I wanted to bring it all the way back into sort of your career journey and how you got started as a individual. Were you born in the Philippines? Is that
no?
Oh, okay.
I was actually born and raised in Vancouver, Canada.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. And then I'm going to date myself here, but when I was a junior in high school, which was in the mid 90s, my parents decided to move back to the Philippines. So they were like reverse expats basically. Right. And so they moved back to the Philippines and gave me the option to either come back or stay in Vancouver. And I would say that the decision for me to actually try to move to the Philippines and basically get connected with my roots is probably the most formative decision I've ever made in my life. Because, all roads led back to Manila for me. Yeah. I've spent a lot of time abroad, even after that high school stint. But yeah, basically wound up here permanently in about 2008. Okay. Was my permanent move back to the Philippines.
Was that a decision you made? Like, I talk a lot about, Asian Australians that, sort of growing up here, you sort of sometimes feel that lack of identity. You're not sure what your roots are. Was coming back to the Philippines part of that?
Well, the permanent move was probably accidental. Wind up working in New York City in 2008. But of course, 2008, New York, you think about the history of the world economy at that point. That was probably the worst time for me to try to look for work out there. So I actually wound up moving back to the Philippines, actually staying with my parents with my tail between my legs, and trying to figure out what to do next, because there was really nothing that I could pull off in North America at the time. And yeah, we'll go through this later on, but it was a random series of events that led me to where I am today. But yeah, I would say that looking back now, this idea of identity and being a second generation, child of immigrants, basically. There's always kind of this weird, I don't know, you just don't, for me, I never felt comfortable in the Western world. I grew up there. I grew up in Vancouver, which very famously does have a very strong Asian population, very large one. And Canada is very multicultural in general. I went to school in the US, in upstate New York, quite multicultural, even maybe a little less so than Vancouver, but still quite multicultural. But none of that ever felt like home. None of it ever felt like comfortable. And we can go into a variety of reasons for that. But basically, coming back to the Philippines, visiting my parents, visiting my family every, let's say every summer, every Christmas, since when I moved back in the mid-90s, that felt like home. So actually, when it came to starting the businesses and starting my career, let's say my real career in the Philippines, it didn't feel foreign, even though I spent most of my life abroad. It felt like home, which was kind of cool.
Yeah. I was going to say, like, you're probably, I don't know, I might be just speaking like a non-truth here, but if it was rare for someone to come back to the Philippines, like you hear a lot of stories of, there's a very large Filipino diaspora outside the Philippines, in Australia, in US, all over Asia, but yet you're probably one of the few that I know that have actually returned. And I don't think that's common. Is that a fair statement?
I would say that the generation before me, totally. I was definitely like going against the flow of, let's say, my parents and my aunts and my uncles and all that, who always looked abroad to the Western world as, just a path out. And yes, you're right. There's, a very famous phrase in the Philippines is actually brain drain, right? Where basically people would graduate from the best universities here and immediately look for work abroad because of, well, the perceived salary bump. And obviously everything else, your taxes go to work there, blah, 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 blah. But I think that, it's not just me, but I think there was a small generation of people around my age, about 40, so just to share with everybody, that really looked at the Philippines differently. And that could be a lot of different reasons, right? It could be because it was a little bit more stable back in, that time, early 2000s, let's say, early to mid 2000s. Could be that, the rest of the world kind of looked like crap, let's be honest, the economies at that point. And there is definitely this feeling sometimes, and even more so now, by the way, right? Because now there's like a lot of people that are coming back to the Philippines, right? Sea turtles is the term I hear about all the time now. Second generation immigrants, children of immigrants who are moving back to the Philippines because actually there's a great opportunity to be a big fish in a small pond, right? The Philippines has 112 million people, but the population is not it's not representative of the quote unquote pond. Do you know what I mean? The pond in it of itself, Manila, Makati, the business district, that's made up of 10,000 people, 100,000 people, decision makers. But that actually leads to a lot of great opportunity, right? If you can come from the Western world, live a comfortable life abroad, move to the Philippines and see where you can actually, what was comfortable abroad, you can actually affect change to make it that way in a developing nation like the Philippines. That in and of itself is opportunity, right? And I think that's kind of what you see now with a lot of people that are quote unquote sea turtles moving back to the Philippines. And we have portfolio companies. It actually fits into some of the investment thesis of Foxmont, right? We actually think about that meaningfully. And we say, hey, wait a minute, there are literally people coming back from universities in the States. They're spending their time here. They're not going to be like these, junior level kids. They're going to take, be management trainees at some large, publicly listed, American corporation. They are looking for funding. They have great ideas. They have the resilience, even just the idea of moving from North America or the Western world to the Philippines. That's already resilience. And that's already taking risk. So they already have that. What if we fund them? And what if we give them some money to solve a Filipino problem? So yeah, I mean, I think that going back to all the way back to the original question, yeah, I think that yes, I was probably quite rare in my time for going against the flow. But since 2008, 2009, 2010, I think that you're actually seeing a lot of people coming back to the Philippines, a lot.
Yeah.
And it's becoming a very interesting place to actually, work and start a business.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, like, the opportunities are there for those who do want to come back, not just for the Philippines, but, Southeast Asia in general. I was going to say, like, you yourself, you're probably one of the, great examples of, someone that did return and made a career and found a niche within what they were doing. Just to unpack that a little bit, can we go into a bit more about, you came back to the Philippines, and then what did you do and how did you progress your career?
Yeah, like I said, totally tail between my legs in 2008. November 2008, I came back here, and I mean, if you do the math, I told you I was 40, and I had finished a career in basically international sales abroad. I'd gone to New York, and I mean, I guess stupidly thought that and confidently thought that I was going to find a job quite easily, given all the experience I had in that previous industry. And basically blew all my savings, right, in a very short period of time, because I was in New York and I was with friends, and it was like I could justify it. I thought I could stay in like nice places and I'll find a job easily, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, none of that actually happened. So I wound up back in the Philippines, really with not that much money in my pocket, and being forced to really think creatively about how to sustain myself in basically what is a relatively foreign environment. Like, I wasn't that comfortable with the business community in the Philippines as of yet. I did not have a network here, nor did I know a lot of people. But it forced me to look on, look upon the limited network that I had back then, and see what sort of people I was comfortable working with, and what sort of skill sets there were out there. And I think that was super important in those days. And I think that's still important now, by the way, in a place like the Philippines, to find great partners that you trust, right? And I did. And I started a media company back then called Global Media, with a great partner that had worked with me in my previous company. And together, we went out and we partnerships with some of the world's leading brands, using the Philippines as its backbone, to do, advertising sales, to create reports, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That kind of kicked off my entrepreneurial journey. So I was basically forced to do that, right? It was being opportunistic almost. And for the first 3 or 4 years, that's really what I focused on. But I think my journey into actually startups and tech-enabled businesses really began in 2012, when an old friend called me up and said, "Hey, Franco, listen, I know that you've done some work in starting up businesses." It wasn't even startups back then, right? It was starting up businesses in a place like the Philippines, and there's not that much. There are not that many people in the Philippines that have done that, right? Back in 2012, usually in the Philippines, most people, very conservative, they'll graduate from a good university, either go abroad, or they'll join like a large conglomerate here, right? Or an FMCG, let's say, like Nestle, or one of these large companies. So he calls me up and he says, "Franco, you've got a history of building businesses, and I've been asked to help build a company here in the Philippines. And would you be interested?" And that guy, his name, by the way, is Jesse Maxwell, who today is now a partner at Foxmont with me, right? And I go, "Okay, what is this business?" He goes, "Well, it's like hailing taxis with your phone." And I go, "Dude, you all taxis with it's either with your hand or with your phone. You're gonna call, right?" And he's like, "No, you're not calling. You're actually using an app." And I still couldn't get my head around it, but eventually he said, "Why don't you just meet the founder? He's coming here like next week." And sure enough, I go and I meet the founder, and the founder is Anthony Tan, and that company is back then known as MyTeksi, but today known as Grab. So I actually wound up being the first general manager of Grab in the Philippines back in 2012. And that gave me my insight into, tech-enabled business. Actually, it's two things. Fast-growing tech-enabled businesses, that's one. But two is actually venture backing with these tech-enabled businesses and the sort of impact it can make in developing countries. Those were the two key things I picked up from working with Grab in the first 2 years that they were in the Philippines. And by the way, that was interesting too, because that was, a lot of people don't know this, but Grab actually grew. The first country that Grab grew to internationally, back then it was MyTeksi, was in fact the Philippines. Right. And then I think it's sometimes it's just a matter of semantics, but it's true that actually the Philippines started and only a month later did Thailand start. And then I think a month after that was Vietnam. But this was the first country that Grab grew into. So I think, that thankfully, and thank you to Anthony Tan and to Jesse for giving me that opportunity. I think that kind of helps solidify a lot of the reputation that I might have today in a country like the Philippines, and help me grow my network of founders, basically get me on the ground level of what was going to become one of the fastest growing startup ecosystems in the region, which is the Philippines. And that's like right now. Right. But in 2012, let me tell you, there was like 5 founders and me.
Yeah. I was going to say, I was going to ask you the question around, what's the ecosystem like back then versus, now? And I guess you sort of answered that question, was it 8 years ago? It wasn't really, it was very nascent, not very quite a new industry. And then I think you've seen it grow over time to what it is now. How would you describe, the ecosystem currently in the Philippines?
I would say that we are at the inflection point in the Philippines, right? I think that many ecosystems start slowly and kind of like not a lot of people know about it, and then all of a sudden they come out of nowhere, and all of a sudden everybody's interested. And that's exactly literally November 8th, which is when we're recording this podcast. This day in 2021 is literally one of the key days in the history of startups. I mean, why do I say startups in the Philippines? Why do I say that? This year alone, it's well, first of all, for Foxmont, we've already looked at over 100 different startup founders deals in the last 3 months. Okay, so in other words, we're probably at 200, if I were to guess, going back to January, right? Now, compare that to what I just said. I mean, there's there were 5 founders in 2013. There's a group on Facebook, and I'll use Facebook as a reference because, Filipinos love it. Let's be honest, right? 4 hours per day on Facebook, right? There's a Facebook group. It's called Startup PH. Anybody that's interested in, looking and understanding the startup ecosystem in the Philippines should actually just join Startup PH, and you'll see that, right? Now, when I was invited to join Startup PH, my first reaction was, WTF is that? And why would I want to do that? But I do distinctly remember that actually that community only had 30 people in it in early 2013. That's how few people were in that Facebook page, right?
Yeah.
And for the first 2 or 3 years, it still only grew from 30 to 100, right? It was not that much, right? Today, if I were to just do a quick search on it, I believe, I did a quick check, I think I did a quick check 2 weeks ago, and it was at 30,000.
Wow.
40,948.
Wow.
Right. This is, it's kind of like a random number I just threw out there, but this shows you how many people are interested in just the word startup. And at least understand what that is in the context of the Philippines. The Philippines is thriving, right? And a lot of that has to do with just the last 2 years because of the pandemic. We went from an analog country in March 2020, analog, meaning I still went to the ATM. I mean, when was the last time you went to an ATM, Sean? Come on, let's be honest, right? You use wallets, you use digital banking apps. You pay friends using like apps. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Last year, March 2020, I was printing out bills, going to the ATM and paying over the counter. Analog. And that's me, analog. But today, the Philippines has leapfrogged, right? In other words, you don't leapfrog because like people don't use laptops in the Philippines. People don't use desktops in the Philippines. We leapfrogged all of that and we're just like purely mobile.
Yeah.
And we're catching up so fast to the rest of the world. Our internet's not that bad. It's really not, right? It's, you know, it's not that expensive. And all of that leads to some great, great opportunities for founders to find great businesses that are really just capitalizing on the digitalization of this country. Vietnam had fast internet for a long time. Indonesia's had internet and a thriving ecosystem for a long time. I would say that in Indonesia's ecosystem has been around for like 10 years, right? But the Philippines, all of that, the ecosystem, the digital infrastructure, all of that has been compressed during the pandemic when we were all indoors in what could be perceived as the world's longest lockdown at 3.5 months, where I was only allowed out once a week with my little quarantine pass to go to the grocery. Imagine a country where people were going to the ATM like and lining up there during payday. All of a sudden forced not to do that. They couldn't do it. They couldn't even go to the ATM. Imagine the mass digitalization that has happened while we all sat indoors. That's the state of it today. And that's how it's grown, right? It went fast. You know, like, let me just share one really interesting story about Grab. So of course, in the early days, I was the guy who set up, you know, MyTeksi Phillippines Facebook page. I was the guy who set up MyTeksi, you know, Twitter, whatever. I did all the social media because basically it was me and this girl named Natasha, who now works for 917 Ventures. It was basically just the two of us in the office. In the early days, this is a great example of how people just did not understand the app ecosystem. When I set up that Facebook page, we had more booking requests on the Facebook Messenger messages than we did on the actual app itself. People would actually send messages to MyTeksi Philippines that would say, hello, please pick me up at this bus stop at this time and drop me home at this location. And I actually had to explain to them, I'm like, you have to please go to the app store. Please set your PIN. And they're like, easier to go through you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Today,
you know, if you look at the typical Filipino consumer, I mean, they have a wallet, right? And a lot of people, they, you know, just to make a comparison, they went from unbanked, money under the bed, to having a wallet, no more bank account. They're like, forget it. I don't need a bank account. They just bypassed that whole bricks and mortar and went straight to the digital wallet.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great story.
Yeah, that's basically the Philippines today.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to say that, I'm not going to compare us to some of our regional peers like Singapore yet, but we are definitely at the precipice of some amazing digital transformation in this country.
That's a really great story. No, it's really great to hear that. Like, we always talk about the Philippines being, at least a perception, at least, is sort of, you know, this sort of backwards place that, you know, people, you know, don't really want to be in.
Exactly.
But, you know, obviously there is a lot of inequality, not just in the Philippines, but across everywhere. But, you know, you would think over time with digitalization and, you know, the reverse brain drain, that eventually some of those problems will get alleviated over time. And people like yourselves, you know, coming in and really contributing to the ecosystems.
That's right.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to, like, we can unpack a bit more about the opportunities and so forth. What I wanted to get, just to fill out the gap, was you were at Grab and then you founded Foxmont in 2018. Bring us to that journey about how that happened and why you did it.
Sure. So, I left Grab 2014, and it was on great terms. It was just that I was very tired. I was burnt out, operationally.
Yeah.
Building a business like that meant being talking to taxi drivers at like 3 a.m, training them on how to use a cell phone, by the way, not even just the app, but how to use the cell phone. And by the time 2014 came around, I was pretty tired, and I went back to global media for a while and kind of help build that business. But in the meantime, what I also wound up doing was helping other startups, right? Helping other startups by, consulting with them, working with them on everything from their sales to their deck, to their business development, to everything, with the idea that it would make it then much easier for them to, raise money from funds. But let me tell you, it was not that easy. Despite my experience with Grab, despite my own connections and network, it was not that easy to sit with somebody, advise them, and help them build their business to what I thought was a strong enough use case and business case in the Philippines, to then go to the foreign funds. And when I say foreign, I mean Singaporean funds, and try to get a check released. And I realized that actually the key reason for that is because Singaporean funds in general, and even some of the local corporate venture capital firms in general, they have a huge budget. It's not even a budget, it's a huge fund. They have hundreds of millions of dollars, assets under management. So the types of tickets that they're trying to let go of are going to be like $1 million, $2 million, right? And that's simply too big for a little startup in the Philippines that's just trying to start. So actually there was a space in the ecosystem that I never realized needed to be filled. And that was, again, going all the way back to my introduction, that was early stage independent venture capital. That was the first check in that actually not only showed trust in the founder, but actually played a role in being the filter to these larger funds abroad. And you know what? Obviously, it worked a little bit because you just look at our portfolio and look at the way that they've been fundraising since. And it's not like I, came up with this out of nowhere, right? But there are regional examples of this, right? So if you actually look at like Indonesia, which, by the way, of course, as we all know, is the most thriving ecosystem in all of Southeast Asia. If you actually look at it, they have 5 independent early stage venture capital firms, right? Ranging from like East Ventures to Alpha JWC to Kajora, blah, 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 right? But that was the key missing piece of the ecosystem. When East Ventures emerged onto the scene in 2011 and made their first investment in Tokopedia, that to me was their like inflection point, right? That's when they were like, oh my God, okay, I'm going to keep on investing in like local startups. And then the local startups are like, oh my God, my first check should come from either East Ventures or Alpha JLBC or whoever. And that inflection point has happened, right, in the Philippines with Foxmont and with our first investee company, which was Kumu. Right. And so we're just, listen, I have the utmost respect for what Indonesia has done. And all I do is replicate that.
Yeah.
And I think we're starting to get there. We're starting to show the rest of the world that there is, in and of itself, an opportunity in the Philippines, that you don't have to put all your money in Indonesia. And by the way, you should, as an investor, you should definitely look at Indonesia. That's 250 million people, right, that are super digital right now. And any opportunity you have to get in to the consumer, amazing, right?
Yeah.
But the Philippines has 100 million people, Sean. We have half the number. We have the second largest population in Southeast Asia. We also have the youngest population. I don't know if a lot of people know that, but our average age in the Philippines is 25.8 years old. That's actually younger than Indonesia, which I think is hovering slightly over 27 years old, and much younger than Thailand. Sorry, but Thailand's kind of old. I don't know if you knew this, but they're almost averaging 40 years old.
Really? Wow. Okay. No idea.
Yeah. which was a shocking fact for me to know, actually. Because I was always, back in the day when, I didn't have the fund and I was trying to figure out, how come Indonesia was making all this money and getting all the investments? I was like, Thailand seems like they've got their act together. And I didn't realize that, yeah, they have their act together, doing very well. The infrastructure is strong. But their population is not that big. That's one. But the other is they're kind of old. Sorry to all my Thai friends. Sorry to all of Sean's Thai friends out there. But the Philippines is young. It's got 112 million people, largest population. We spend an average of 10 hours per day on the internet. That's a long time. And then 4 hours per day on social media. Okay, thank you, Facebook. Thank you, Mr. Mark Zuckerberg, for your free internet that has thus made all Filipinos think of the internet as Facebook. You know how you Google things? You're like, oh, I'm going to Google that. Well, in the Philippines, everybody thinks of Facebook as the internet. It's crazy, man.
Yeah, wow.
It's
a great tactic. It's a great tactic they did, doing this free internet across South and Southeast Asia. It's really genius.
Yeah, it's smart. But if you think about it, it's a lot of built-up tension too. It's kind of like a slingshot, right? A lot of built-up tension, meaning to say that you had all these guys that were learning how to use the internet. This population learning how to use the internet. Okay, and they were like learning and learning and learning, and then only at the peak of the slingshot were they like, oh my God, it's only Facebook I've learned. And then they let go, and it's like, okay, it's like I can do like digital bank-to-bank transfers. I can pay stuff online. I can buy things online. Like all of these things Filipinos are literally just learning now.
Wow.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. It's amazing how things have changed so quickly as well. I mean, it just shows you the growth opportunities there are in the region. I just wanted to go back slightly. And when you first setting up Foxmont, was it difficult to convince people when you were raising that first fund?
Hell yeah. Hardest thing in the world. What right do I have? Who am I? Who am I? Especially let's be honest, right? Most people that run funds, they have Harvard business degrees and, it's just extremely, and most people that run funds, if you actually really look at it, it's people that have had exits and have they're multimillionaires and they're doing venture capital for fun almost, it seems like, right? Which, by the way, it is fun. It's the secret of life. Let me tell you. I'll explain to you why later on. But who am I, right? But again, it goes back to, in a country like the Philippines, finding the right partners, right? And I did. All credit goes to my two other partners, Jesse Maxwell and Mark Koyman, who independent of me have some serious skill sets, right? Mark, he's both of them, first of all, are the smartest people I know in this country. So thank God, because their average IQ has actually lifted up Foxmont's total average, right? And Mark, he's got some great experience in fund management. He used to run a private equity firm out of China called the Development Principles Group. So he knew, the ins and outs of fund management, which, to be fair, up until about 3 years ago, I had no idea. All I knew is that I wanted to deploy capital to the Philippines, right? Jesse, on the other hand, has this great network. He graduated HBS 2011. And I don't know if you know the history of HBS 2011 or your readers do, or sorry, your listeners do. What the hell? Whatever. I came from media. Your listeners do. But HBS 2011, they're going to write a book about that, because that's basically the graduating class of some of Asia's unicorns, right? And when I say that, I mean Coupang in Korea. So the founders of Coupang graduated HBS 2011. Anthony Tan, Grab, HBS 2011. The third one is actually Nadim Makarim.
Of Gojek. Yeah.
So Jesse has got this great insight into how his peers, his friends, had grown their businesses regionally into unicorns. And of course, remember, he was the first investor of Grab in the Philippines. sits as a director of Grab today here in the Philippines, and brings, to the table, his own personal network plus his knowledge of that. And I think we were the best possible team that we could have put together for that fund. But to go right to your question, even with that, yeah, it was really hard, really hard. And in fact, our first close of our first fund was $1.4 million. I mean, what is $1.4 million? But like, you know what I mean? Like come on, right? And a chunk of that, a good chunk of that, way more than what is standard for fund management today, for fund managers today, was committed by us as the three GPs. We covered most of that. Well, not most, but a good chunk of that.
Yeah,
a lot of it. And it was only, thankfully, our first few investments really did perform well. Most famously, of course, Kumu. That was our first check. The rise and the popularity, or not the popularity, but the success or the perceived success of Foxmont. The book of Foxmont will never be written without, the book of Kumu, right? I mean, the Kumu in and of itself has, besides being, let's say, the Philippines' grassroots tech champion, it was really, key in the success of Foxmont and the way that we've been able to since fundraise. We were the first institutional check-in, I should say, right? Yep. First institutional check-in.
Can you explain exactly what Kumu is for those who don't know what it is, and I guess on top of that, why you invested in them as well?
So Kumu is a live streaming app that focuses on the Philippines and the Philippine diaspora. So ostensibly a social media app, actually, if you think about it. And when I say live streaming, a lot of people say, liken that to TikTok. But the reality is that they're actually quite different from each other. And the reason I say that is because TikTok is short form, pre-recorded, trendy videos, right? That's basically TikTok. Whereas Kumu is long form, live videos where you can interact with the speakers or the streamers. And when I say long form, I mean like the average, for a while at least, I have to look at their numbers again, but for a while they were averaging like 4 or 5 hours per day per streamer. That's how long they were online. And by the way, that also is a testament to the strength of the Philippine internet now. Right? I mean, most of these streamers are like doing it out of their mobile connections, and they're able to do, 4 or 5 hours straight. No
problems. Yeah.
No problems. And so Kumu, when we invested in them, maybe they had 5 full-time employees and a few, part-timers, and, several hundred live streamers, I would say, maybe less. And today they have, multiples of millions of monthly active users. They have like hundreds of employees, multiple buildings in the middle of Makati, the middle of Metro Manila, and contribute millions of dollars to the GDP of the Philippine economy. So definitely one of the fast-growing grassroots startups. And I make a distinction about grassroots because the Philippines already very famously just announced a unicorn, Gcash. But of course, Gcash is a conglomerate-backed startup, right? Yeah. So they were basically born out of a conglomerate. But Kumu really was born in the streets of Sinigang Valley. And I'll tell you what Sinigang Valley is in a little bit, but it's our version of Silicon Valley, obviously. And what made us invest in them? I mean, quite simply, the wow factor, right? We met with the 2 founders, Rexy and Roland, here in a hotel in Manila in 2018. And they showed us their app. And at that point, there were multiple live streamers on there already. And Roland did something very simple. He said, look at this reaction. So he turned on the app, turned on to a live streamer, and immediately the live streamer noticed that Roland, the founder, popped into the popped into her stream. And that live stream was like, oh my God, it's Roland. Thank you for joining my live stream. Thank you so much. Like, so excited, right? And we're like, okay, that's cool, but that's because you're the founder, dude. And then he said, yeah, but check this out. And he takes this and he shows us like, he basically just taps his screen a bunch of times. But basically what he's doing is scrolling through what looked like emojis at the time, right? But turned out to be virtual gifts. Okay, and what are virtual gifts? I mean, you basically prepay for them, right? And they are worth, whatever form they are, whatever cartoon they might be, whatever emoji, quote unquote, they might be, is worth money to the streamer. So you're tipping them. So he goes, look at this. This is a Malacanang. And we're like, what the hell is a Malacanang? Now, in the context of Philippines, Malacanang really means something. It's actually the White House of the Philippines, right? It's where the president lives. But in the context of Kumu, a Malacanang is actually the most expensive gift you could give somebody. Like, it's like dropping a lot of money, like $100 on somebody, right? As a tip. So it's like, I don't know, you're at a bar and you give your waiter $100 tip. I mean, that waiter is going to be like, thank you, and then take care of you the whole night, right? He drops his Malacanang on this live streamer, and that person, like, there's a girl, she starts crying. Oh, thank you so much. Like, I can't believe it. This is my first Malacanang. This is the first time anybody's ever, paid attention to, this stream, blah, blah, blah. And that reaction on its own was like, that was it. For me and my partners, for Jesse, for Mark and myself, we were like, yo, this is what you're going for. This is the authentic connection that you're going for. And he keeps on repeating that, right? Rexy and Roland will say this all the time. It's about authentic connections. And in a world full of likes and double tap for hearts and shares and retweets and all this crap, here's a moment on social media where you can actually share a moment. You know that you're making a difference to that person's life at that moment. And what we didn't understand at that point that we do today is that authentic connection that was being built between live streamer and viewer actually translated to live streamers in the Philippines creating authentic connections with the Filipino diaspora abroad. So the Filipinos that are all abroad, people who would have probably been my parents back in the 80s or 90s, that miss the Philippines, that were stuck abroad because they couldn't come back to the Philippines because of the pandemic, all of a sudden were flocking to Kumu because they missed the Philippines.
Wow.
And Kumu 20x'd everything last year during the pandemic. 20x users, 20x revenue, 20x everything. And that is Kumu. And that's why we invested. Because they were building a community, and anything that's community based in a place like the Philippines, that will do well. That's a tip for you and your audience.
Okay.
Listeners.
No, thanks for sharing that story. I think it really gives insight into, the early era and stages of, investing in a company like Kumu, and realizing, the opportunity when you did sit down with the founders and, you saw that reaction, that meaningful connection that they were able to generate through an app. It's a really great story. I'm just conscious of time, but there's so many questions I want to ask. I mean, you're such a great storyteller.
Thank you.
It's been great listening to you. But I think you mentioned earlier about Foxmont being the only independent VC company in a sea of, I guess, other companies that are backed by, I don't know, what, families or corporations. Can you delve into a bit of that landscape?
So when you look at the Philippines today, what you'll basically see is mostly corporate-backed venture capital firms. The very first venture capital firm that ever existed in this country, I might be discounting some others, but let's put it this way: the first very active venture capital firm in this country is actually one called Kickstart, and all kudos to the people that run Kickstart, especially Minette Navarrete, because I think she's done a great job of basically seeding the ecosystem, right? But Kickstart is, in fact, a corporate venture capital firm related to one of the large conglomerates in this country, which is called the Ayala Group. And since then, there have been 2 or 3 other venture capital firms that basically have one LP, right? Which is the conglomerate in and of itself, or members of the conglomerate's family, let's say.
Yeah.
In that case, I would say that, of course, when you look at corporate venture capital, the mandate and the investment thesis often is very different from what an independent venture capital firm would look for, right? Corporate venture capital, of course, will always have to have their one LP in mind. Will have to make sure that their one LP is quite happy. And how is their one LP going to be happy? But of course, having that startup drive value to the conglomerate in and of itself, right? But that on its own to an early stage startup could provide, well, first, it could be very helpful. Let's be honest, right? I mean, you're given like basically open doors to access, banks, telcos, malls, retail, pharmacies, whatever. But there's another side of that where they might be limited because they might be too aligned to one conglomerate too early. Right? There's always a challenge there. And how do you balance that as an early stage? I'm talking like early stage founder. How do you balance that? So what we provide as independent venture capital is, well, balance. The ability to take capital with there's no restriction actually. It's just here's my money, please grow unrestricted. Go nuts. And by the way, I'm a pretty good mentor, is basically what we say. Please listen to us mentor you too. And so the landscape basically has 3 corporate venture capital firms that are quite active now in the country. Okay, but they all have very large AUMs and are therefore looking for later stage deals now. And then we have, one firm that's aligned with a foreign VC firm, right? So that's, I won't name them, but you could probably just do your research and see. But of course, their IC is basically based abroad, not necessarily looking at the Philippines all the time.
Yeah.
Well, they do a pretty good job too. And then we have some very early stage like angel networks. But that's it.
Wow.
And then there's us.
It just shows you how early, it's still really early days. You think about, what you talked about Indonesia, how all those VC firms popped out, 10 years ago, and you're pretty much the first mover.
That's right. I mean, Indonesia has 5, Vietnam has 5, the Philippines has 1.
Wow.
Oh, by the way, just to make it, just to be clear for everybody that's trying to compete with us in the future, it's really hard. It's so hard. I'm having such a hard time. It's so difficult, and I wouldn't wish this on anybody.
You mentioned a point about the Philippines version of Silicon Valley, Sinigang Valley. What is that exactly? And yeah.
So Sinigang Valley is basically this idea, right? That I would say that the previous generations of startups in the Philippines really found themselves, and this is inherent in the Philippines and I think in any developing nation, where everybody was just extremely competitive with each other. They just felt like the pockets where money was being drawn from was limited. So you had to be competitive with each other. And that's fine. That's natural, I think. And just in general, when you're running a fast growing business, you want to be the best, no matter what, across all industries. But Sinigang Valley, I think, tries to flip that on its head a little bit and makes things a little bit more collaborative, right? So just in general, the idea is a collaborative startup ecosystem and community. But very specifically, there is one street in the middle of Manila where a lot of different parts of the ecosystem are starting to come together, right? So there's a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in the middle of the business district called Poblacion, right? And there is one street in Poblacion, very small, it's like 200 meters, that a lot of people are moving into. So the first one was actually Kumu. Kumu took a building at the end of the street, an entire building at the end of the street, where it was basically like a work, play, live type of situation. Their live streamers could live there. Their employees could live there. And then they had office spaces there as well. And across the street, there's something that's starting up, opening up called the Fund House. So a lot of investors like Foxmont and some of the funds I was just talking about, will have office space there as well. And then down the street, you're having all these different startups that are looking for space already and starting to basically move in. And the reason I'm using the like future tense, like looking for space, is because of course we've all been in lockdown. So only now can we actually actively look at places. And so the idea is that basically it's going to be one street where you walk, you look to your right, and oh look, there's a Series A guy right there. Oh look, there's a Series B guy. Oh look, there's Kumu, Series C. And then, oh, I've got a new idea. I'm just going to walk into the fund house and pitch, every single investor there is. And so that's kind of the concept behind Sinigang Valley. And there's actually a website, siniganvalley.com. The idea, the name actually came from Rexy of Kumu. And it really came from like a conversation where, we were all just chatting. And we're like, yo, if Kumu's taking a building there, we should all get everybody in there. And then Rexy just randomly drops the name Sinigang Valley, and everybody loved it, and it's taken off. So it's the new spot to be at in Manila. And anybody that's in the startup ecosystem, anybody that's visiting Manila in the future that will be working within the startup ecosystem should in fact take the opportunity to go to Sinigang Valley and just like literally knock on doors. Meet startup A, meet startup B, meet startup C, and meet the investors.
Yeah, no, I've got to check it out. I haven't actually been to the Philippines before, so I'd definitely be keen to check it out.
It's going to be fun.
The verticals and sectors that you're most keen on at the moment. So obviously we talked about Kumu, we've talked about, the rapidly digital economy, young population, etc. What other sectors and verticals are you looking at now at the moment?
So, Foxmont being a country-specific fund, we are basically sector agnostic, right? Mm-hmm. So we will invest in what I always say is, as long as it's solving a Filipino problem with a Filipino solution, then we will most likely invest in it, especially if the founders are, super strong. Mm. But in general, what is exciting is I think anything that accesses the consumer, right? So again, the digitalisation of the Philippines is a big theme right now. And that, B2B plays are going to be the future. That's for sure, right? When, conglomerates, large FMCGs, et cetera, start really focusing on optimization of their businesses, then I think B2B has a very strong play in the Philippines, right? But in the meantime, the most urgent thing and the most rapidly growing part of the economy is actually the consumer. We have a rapidly growing middle class. Almost everybody is now online. Everybody's using digital wallets, so we're becoming less of a cash on demand economy. Anybody that's going to do like vertical e-commerce, for example, right? And what do I mean by vertical e-commerce? I mean like focusing specifically on one vertical. I think they could do very well. We invested in one called Edamama last year, which is basically it's a baby website, right? Where you buy your diapers, etc. They went from like, I don't know if they'll allow me to share their GMV numbers, but they basically, they went from zero April of last year because they hadn't started to like lots and lots. Sorry, I'll just leave it like that. Like impressively a lot. Cloud Kitchen's another one that's B2C. Also started at zero last year during the pandemic because, well, they only started during the pandemic and now are lots and lots. We move lots and lots and lots of food per day. So anybody that wants to access that, I think it's a very exciting place to be. Fintech in the Philippines, obviously there's a lot of different places to play within just that industry alone. We see a lot of BNPL now. So that's kind of interesting. We see a lot of, the loan side of things I think is interesting, and just, trying to access different financial products to the individual in a sachet style. I think that's important in the Philippines too. If you could sachet out anything, services, goods to the Philippines, that's already going to be a winner, huh? I don't know if you know this, but like, for example, Filipinos, generally, we don't buy entire bottles of shampoo. We buy like little tiny sachets of it.
No
so
idea.
we know how to, we appreciate the sachet style.
Gotcha.
So that kind of stuff is very interesting to us.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, just in general, Foxmont has already invested in like 28 different companies. And they all range from, education to, but it's always consumer driven right now.
Yeah. It just sounds like the opportunities are plenty. Essentially, it's like no matter what vertical you're looking at or what industry, it's plenty of opportunities for those who are interested in coming and checking it out. So it'd be great.
That's right.
Yeah, I know we're running out of time. So one of the last questions I wanted to ask was around the I'll just say general advice. I don't know. I hate the word general advice because, advice can mean different things to many people. Obviously, you've had a very different life experience to, a lot of other people. But, do you have any just general advice for young professionals out there just trying to navigate their careers? Do you have any words of wisdom?
Yeah. It's never the end of the world. Let's be honest. I've felt so many times in the past that it's the end of the world. I've always thought I made the wrong decision. I always thought I screwed up. I should have done this over that. But actually the reality of it is that all paths lead to where you're at the moment. And as long as you trust the process and trust what you're going through and your own internal decision making, that things should work out. And that's for sure, right? And especially in entrepreneurship, right? If you're going to go down the entrepreneurial path, oh my God, you will question yourself every day of your life. I still question myself now. I wake up in the mornings, I'm like,
what am I doing?
Yeah, what am I doing? Or I go to bed and I'm like, am I doing this right? But just trust it. Just trust your internal kind of, your internal compass. And you'll get places. I gotta say, I know it sounds super general. It's a general answer to a general question, but I've experienced so much failure in my life that, but I still to this day can't think of anything I would have done differently, because now I'm empowered and now I'm educated to know what I can and cannot do and what I should and should not do. And I think that that's so important in anybody's life. If you do everything right, I mean, you just, then the one time you fail, it's going to feel really bad.
It's going to hurt. Yeah.
Yeah. But if you do everything wrong and then the one time you succeed, it feels really good.
It's going to be sweet.
Hey,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah.
That's very nice for you.
No, it's great. It's a great point you lean on. I think a lot of young people, especially, it's hard to back yourself in some ways, because you're always, there's a lot of external voices when you're growing up. Parents are saying, don't do this, don't do that. And then you're growing up, you're trying to figure out your own internal compass and you're sort of being, led astray. But then in the end of the day, I feel people do know themselves the best. And then if they do follow that internal compass, that eventually, no matter how long that will take, that will lead them somewhere. So yeah, no, great advice.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Just finally, before we wrap things up, where can people, learn more about yourself or reach out to you or just learn about Foxmont in general?
Sure.
Where can they start?
Well, definitely the website. So foxmontcapital.com. If you want to take a look at our portfolio companies and our investment thesis and who else is on the team. First of all, I would implore everybody to actually reach out to the team. I think, Foxmont in and of itself, it's not just me. And I just benefit from the great work that the Foxmont team does. So please, reach out if you want to talk to anybody within the Foxmont team and their own expertise. And then if they want to reach out to me directly, I'm pretty easily reached on LinkedIn, actually. So if people wanted to just kind of, ping me over there, no problem. I'll take the meeting. I'll take the message.
Sweet.
Well, I don't know if I'll take the meeting, but I'll take the message. So that's a good place.
All right.
Shoot your shot. I always say, just shoot your shot. Let's see what happens.
You never know what's going to happen. So just like life. So
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Frank. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think you really gave, there's we could have gone another hour. I reckon there's so many questions I wanted to ask around the Philippines. Hopefully someone else can cover that in a different podcast in the future. But yeah, I'd really appreciate your time. And yeah, best of luck with everything else, growing the Philippine ecosystem, and yeah, really enjoy, seeing where you head in the next, 5 to 10 years.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for your time.
Hi guys. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Feel free to listen to the other clips and episodes on the channel, and remember to subscribe and follow. Have a great day.